Alrighty, well, we hope you enjoyed that all. So hello everyone. Welcome to this special Monday night version of Wednesday Night at the Lab. We hope you enjoyed the Serengeti rules. Before we get started with the Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Sean Carroll. Dr. Carroll is an award-winning scientist, writer, educator, and film producer. He is Professor Emeritus of Molecular Biology and Genetics at UW-Madison, and he's currently Vice President for Science Education at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. He's the head of HHMI Tangled Bank Studios and the Belo Simon Chair of Biology at the University of Maryland. Dr. Carroll is an internationally recognized evolutionary biologist. His laboratory research has centered on the genes that control animal body patterns and play major roles in the evolution of animal diversity. Finally, he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's been a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction, and he's earned 2 Emmys for documentary films. His last book was the basis for the Emmy-winning nature film, The Serengeti Rules, which we all just got to enjoy. And we'll share the PBS link for anyone who'd like to watch it later on. And he has a new book, a series of fortunate events, Chance and the Making of the Planet, Life, and You, which you may have heard him talk about a few weeks ago at Wednesday Night at the Lab. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce or to have Dr. Sean Carroll here as part of Darwin Day, Darwin Day 2021.
Hey, hi, everybody. Nice to be back. Anybody see any good movies lately, or at least movies?
Yeah, right. That was actually a really great film, Sean. So I'll make the quick comment before we open it up to the Q&A for the audience. That I thought that was a really beautiful film. From a scientist perspective, I mean, I'm going to use the word simple, but the simple experiments to try and understand keystone species, I thought that was pretty amazing. So I don't know if you'd like to talk to us a little bit about that, and we'll take some questions from the audience to get things going.
Well, sure, I'll start there. I mean, the Bob Payne experiment, the tossing starfish experiment, probably is one of the simplest experiments in biology history. I mean, he had to execute it well. I mean, it was well controlled. He had to stay on top of it. He also repeated it in New Zealand on a sabbatical year. He also went back and did the experiment of removing some other things besides starfish and finding out that they didn't have any effect on community structure. But it really was the case that so much of ecology through the 50s and early 60s was descriptive. And but Bob, inspired particularly by his first mentors at the University of Michigan, was really trying to find out a way to perturb a system and to figure out how the role predators played in communities. And so when he saw those intertidal communities on the coast of Washington, he said, this is it. I found the place. And then he saw results within a matter of months. And, he knew he was onto something and turned, literally turned the general view of sort of the structure of food chains upside down.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. We'll open it up to the audience. I'll actually take it for our first question from YouTube. We had a question right before we even started. So the question is, what other ecosystems have herbivore keystone species that maybe you could talk a little bit about?
Herbivore keystones, got to kind of run through the various things. Well, so keystones don't always have to be predators, right? So there are other, in some cases, you can kind of look at ecosystems engineers. You can see things, some burrowing animals that create habitat for other creatures. You can think of, pollinators. You wouldn't necessarily say they're herbivores, although, the pollinators are not meat eaters. So they're, especially if you're, in the ecosystem engineering sort of business, beavers to a degree, elephants to a degree, as I said, and any kind of pollinator. So these are just, species that have a disproportionate effect on community diversity. There are probably more. They'll probably enter my dead brain cells in the course of this half-hour conversation. It's kind of hard to keep an exhaustive list of the work that's been done out there.
Yeah. So we invite people to unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question. I'll alternate between questions in the chat and questions that can be asked by you all.
I was wondering if fire can be considered similar on a prairie.
Fire, well, I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, the role of fire, on the savanna, as you saw, and obviously the grazers had an effect on the fire regime. So, I think, the Keystone definition is, I think, probably restricted to living things. But I think what we're trying to identify as scientists are those things that contribute and perhaps are not obvious contributors to community diversity. So, fires in the sense of to the degree they enable community diversity and for things to grow that would not necessarily grow on a prairie, then it's constructive to think of it that way. It wouldn't meet the textbook definition, but I don't think you want to think about textbook definitions. You want to think about the best way to manage, ecosystems, at least for those we're entrusted to managing. So, but I think that what probably leads you to, Tom, is thinking about, well, why fire, and then think about sort of the domino effects of what fire does. And yeah, then I think it helps us think about, the connections between the components of ecosystems.
It's also testable, which I thought was really cool. I wrote down 535 as a timeline, and when Bob Payne first said, "How do I test it?" And it's my bias, but I don't think of natural scientists. Growing up, I didn't see them as experimentalists, and to hear that so early in your movie and such a profound idea throughout this is a great idea. How do I test it? And the elegance of the experimental design was great. I mean, that's something really
I appreciate that. I think in this movie in particular, if we were to jot down what we aspire to at Tangled Bank in conveying in films is, of course, the passion of the scientists and why are they drawn to nature, but the scientific process. And it was very challenging to think, how could you test things sort of at this scale? And you see, well, Payne did it, in an intertidal zone, and but Mary Power, and I got to tell you, when I saw this film also had an unusual amount of recreation, actors playing the younger scientists. And you might say, well, you see that in movies, but that was a big risk by the filmmakers. And they were split. Some thought this is going to kill the movie and make it too hokey or whatever. But I think cinematography and authenticity really helped. In one case, Mary as a child, my favorite scene in the movie is her, the scene where she slips underwater for the first time and you see the river as she sees it, and the underwater shot with her above, right? I mean, woo. And then later on, when they recreate the experiment of partitioning the bass and the minnows, that's really the experiment she did. And to go out there and actually recreate the experiment was, I just think really terrific. And so when John Turborg talks about the experiment in Lago Guri, the damming experiment, saying, well, how can I test this idea on land? And then realizing taking an intact ecosystem and breaking it up into islands with the flooding of that dam project. You're hearing the wheels turn of how do we test things, and really on the Serengeti, then Tony Sinclair really understood in hindsight that the perturbation was accidental. The perturbation was first the introduction of rinderpest, and then the perturbation back in the other direction was the vaccination against rinderpest. And to figure out how these systems work, you needed a perturbation to see the two states. So that was, I can certainly say, Tom, that was very deliberate. I mean, it was an important part of the storytelling, but it was really deliberate in the movie that we wouldn't want to cut any of that out. If we didn't, in the editing of a film, it's not just what you show, and it's what you decide not to cut out too.
All your children on the floor of the other.
Yeah. Well, it's probably like a 60-to-1 shot ratio. So, you got 60 hours of footage you're editing down to an hour. So deciding what stays in is a big choice, and minutes and seconds get precious there at the tail end of the edit. But we really wanted to underscore scientific process without, and I think, losing the, sort of the natural history flavor of the film, that sort of inspiring beauty of the systems they worked in.
Uh, the all these systems they showed, of course, they identified the keystone species by experiment. In some of the rarer ecosystems where you don't have a lot of ecosystem to work with, and you can't necessarily run the experiment, or the experiment is too expensive to run, what do you do in those situations? And also, as you pointed out, in the one instance in the Serengeti, it was basically an introduced exotic pest that was responsible for removing the keystone species. What happens with these ecosystems where you've got invasives coming in, and you may not be able to remove them?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I mean, I'm detecting two questions there. One is, what about in systems where you have trouble really doing the experiment? And sometimes I'll just say it's kind of inferential or correlative. So if you look at things like West Africa, if you look in places like Ghana, where, for example, leopards and lions have been, decimated really from certain national park areas, and you look at, for example, at the proliferation of baboons, and you see how baboon behavior changes so that they are down on the ground in the day and very bold and raiding crops and things like this. So, the removal's kind of been done, unintentionally, or numbers have really declined, and you've seen a shift, in the direction of really the behavior of some other animal. It may not be so much that the baboons are not being consumed, for example, by leopards and lions, but you've changed what's called the landscape of fear. The baboons now have no, they're without leopards and lions around, they have no fear, and they're just brazenly just, doing things, in the daylight that they wouldn't have done before. So I'll call that sort of a correlative thing in certain parts of the world where you can see that. And there's
natural
lots
experiment in a way.
What? Pardon me?
Sort of a natural experiment. The situation has occurred where you didn't deliberately manipulated it, but you've got something going on.
It kind of all adds up, and so it's a plausible scenario to interpret it as sort of a keystone type situation. In other cases, and it's not in the film, but what was vital to some of these ideas were the experiments by Steve Carpenter at Wisconsin, first in lakes up north, and then Lake Mendota. It's in the book, it's not in the movie. But when I arrived I'm way off your question, but I'll get back to it in a second.
That's okay.
When I arrived in Wisconsin in 1987, I had no idea. That's when I took a faculty job. I had no idea. That was the year that Mendota was the site of one of the biggest sort of rewilding experiments ever attempted. And that was to restock with things like walleye, massive amounts of walleye fry and things like that to improve water quality and sort of change the balance of things in Lake Mendota. And it turns out there was sort of a fortuitous sort of weather pattern that also sort of killed off some pesky fish, and Mendota's water quality improved after this experiment, and it kind of gets chalked up as one of the success stories, at least for a period of time. But it's funny, I didn't know this story till I wrote the book and sat down with Steve in 2015 to find out what had gone on in Mendota. I felt like an idiot that here's one of the most famous experiments. So it is the case, as you're getting at, that to draw conclusions, the strength of those conclusions just sort of depends on the strength of the experiment. And sometimes you just have correlative data, and it's not practical, not allowed or whatever, to do a manipulation in a controlled way that an experimentalist would want. So I think that over time, you can still make some predictions over time whether the system behaves in the way you think it is, right? So you sort of kind of let the time run and still see whether or not the dominoes are connected in the way you think they're connected. So I think that's a reasonable level of evidence. So I think in keystones across the world, or in trophic cascades across the world, which is the term for the strong indirect effect mediated through the food chain, that the evidence varies in places, but overall the phenomenon, I think, after 50 years on, is pretty well validated.
So we're going to take a couple questions from the chat. So I'm going to kind of copy edit this question a little bit. But wouldn't the question is, wouldn't eventually, sort of any species evolve a predator species? So in a sense, wouldn't eventually, I don't know, for example, that they use the example of Darwin's finches, wouldn't they eventually have a predator species that predate them?
I think that's a really cool question. I'm going to answer that in two ways. First of all, on the Galapagos Islands, there are predatory birds. I didn't know that for a while, but I read some stuff by the Grants fairly recently by Rosemary and Peter Grant. And now I got to remember what there are. They're raptors of some type, and it's escaping my mind. So somebody can remember that. Would there have been a large predator finch? I don't know, but I would think, why not? But in the Caribbean, on the Caribbean islands, especially studied by Jonathan Losos, which have a couple hundred species of anoles, I was struck. I went to Puerto Rico with Jonathan and made a short film. I was struck that, top of the tree, the largest lizards. So this is a very interesting partitioning of space in among the anoles, and that you have these lizards that are sort of on the ground. There's some that sort of on the small limbs and the thin branches, and those that are larger and are on larger branches up top. And then you have these kind of crown lizards that are predators, eat other lizards. So that makes me all think that the question's about right, that it's the evolution of predators, the evolution of predation would be a really interesting topic. I just don't think people have explored it, nearly enough. But it strikes me that among the anoles, you get this gradation from, these little, well, I guess as it is, they are, carnivores. They're usually eating insects and things like that. But, then something evolves that's large enough to eat other lizards. So
if I could chime in on that in a second, just
sure.
the one story that I have. One of my colleagues when I was in the grad student in the zoology department here at UW, Al Muth, he was studying Dipsosaurus dorsalis, a lizard that lives in the desert and mainly feeds on the leaves of creosote bushes and other vegetation. But he was working in a study area that was right adjacent to a suburban development. And he described the backyard of one of these. It was a budding his study area, and the guy there was very fond of grilling steaks out. The guy that lived in the house, and when he was done, he used to throw his leftover steak bones, over the fence, and he observed these herbivorous lizards. And of course, some lizards, they're carnivores when they're small, and they change to herbivores when they get larger. You observe the adults fighting over a steak bone that had some meat on it. So actually, a lot of animals that aren't considered to be carnivorous, given the opportunity, will make use of this very high-grade nutrition.
Well, that's great. It just proves everybody loves barbecue, right?
That's right.
And I just want to thank Karen, who in the chat said there's a Galapagos hawk that's a predator in the island. So thank you for that. Scratching my head for that.
Karen, by the way, the person who ever brought a group to the room that I'm in right now at the Biotech Center in October of 1995.
Fantastic.
It's
awesome.
Great to see her name, and want to give her credit for that. It was 26 years ago.
All right, we'll take another question from the chat. So what keeps keystone species in check? So for example, in the example that I'm shown in the film, what made the wildebeest species or wildebeest population stabilized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you know, as it's played out in the film, Tony Sinclair had the conviction that, these systems had existed for hundreds of thousands of years without human interference, and that there must be mechanisms to regulate them stably. And but but there's a deeper answer to that question. And Tony and his collaborators like Simon Mduma have asked the question, well, what regulates wildebeest numbers? And you could think they could be regulated by the top down by predators, or from the bottom up by food. And they've demonstrated that the wildebeest population is regulated by the bottom up by food. And the way that works is really sort of a per capita regulation. As the amount of food increases, the carrying capacity of the Serengeti for wildebeest increases. But as the amount of food decreases, then the number of wildebeest goes down. And the bottleneck for that, sort of the critical point, is the dry season. So during the dry season, when food becomes really scarce, they actually see really significant, in some years, wildebeest mortality. So it's a sort of a feedback regulation that as the wildebeest numbers grow and essentially reach the carrying capacity of the Serengeti, then they're pretty sensitive to any decrease in food amounts, and that will trim the population back. But as the population numbers drop, as was shown in the Rinderpest years, then there's plenty of, more than enough food per capita, and the population can go through explosive growth.
Also, a lot of carnivores, our top predators, are territorial, and they space themselves out to a certain density.
Amazing thing that Tony and his team did over years and years and years was they actually documented the cause of death of a whole wide variety of Serengeti animals. This is another sort of source of understanding what the cause of death was. And they saw a pretty tight threshold, sort of cut off at around about 150 kilograms, or anything much larger was regulated by food, and anything smaller was regulated by predators. And wildebeest are sort of right on the border around there. But the trick the wildebeest have is they migrate. And you talk about predators being a little more stationary and a little spread out. Yeah, the lions don't follow the migrations because they got to raise their cubs in dens. So the wildebeest, by migration, they do two things, which is they access more food and they escape predation. So there's some wildebeest populations in the Serengeti that are resident and don't migrate. They experience very high levels of predation as a cause of death, not high levels of predation every year. I'm just saying that mortality is largely due to predation. But in the migrating herd, which is the vast majority of wildebeest, they don't experience a very high level of predation, and death is usually due to starvation and disease. Just amazes me that the long-term work, Tony has been in Serengeti more than 50 years, and that's how you can get that kind of data. I mean, he just had, notebooks and notebooks and notebooks on cause of death of all these animals by inspection. There's a classroom film we did on this that in case any of you are teaching anything in this area that Tony's in, and they get Tony to a dead carcass early in the morning one morning, and it turns out the lions had just been there. So there's a few little dramatic seconds there as Tony gets out to inspect the cause of death, and I'm quite glad that Tony's cause of death was not film production. Would be a rather tragic ending of a great career.
Yeah, and of a great film too, I'm sure. So actually, I did have a question. I should have asked you this in the email, but there are a lot of great questions coming in. Would you mind if we extend this by a couple minutes?
Oh, sure.
Since we're approaching that 8:38 time. All right. So awesome. Thank you so much. So another question that came in from the chat, which I think is actually, all these questions are really interesting, but this one's particularly interesting, is how do you know for sure what is the apex predator for a given environment? So in other words, how do you know for sure that the environment has been returned to its pristine condition? And someone added on to that question is, how do you identify absent or extinct keystone species? I'm sure you could elaborate
let's start with the apex predator. In some systems you don't have one. You may have a sort of a guild of predators. So I mentioned, for example, Ghana. It's probably lions and leopards both that play an important role, for example, in regulating baboon populations, which then has sort of knock-on effects. In the sea, you have all these, tuna, cod, et cetera. You have all these large predators. And even in Wisconsin lakes, you wouldn't necessarily have a single predator. It's not always sort of like, bass, minnow, crustacean, algae sort of things. you might have, multiple predators at the top. So it's a group. And so, the discovery of keystone species, I think, it's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was a surprise that these predators had these outsized effects. But it's not like a law that every system you step into, there will be a single keystone. So, there's dozens of keystones that have been demonstrated or kind of strongly correlated across the globe. But as I said, in something like, the open ocean, you can't point to, cod or tuna and say, they're a keystone because of this. There's just a whole web of large predators in the ocean. And then there was the question about how do you identify absent extinct keystone species? Well, I guess you would only know, pretty much in human recorded history, we would only know about extinctions if there was some record that they used to be there and now they're gone. Like, we exterminated wolves from Yellowstone and from much of the, from the lower 48 by the 1920s. That last wolf in Yellowstone was in the 1920s until the reintroduction in 1995. So, the evidence there was just historical records that the other way, and you could look at a fossil record if you thought that maybe there was something that isn't there anymore. You try to see from the fossil record, that might be, for example, in cave remains, more so than in sediments, is something missing. But I have to stretch my brain to think, is the disappearance of any keystone due to anything but humans? And in any recent history we can think of, and I would say no. So generally, we identify absent extinct keystone species from things that we've knocked off, whether it's wolves or beavers or tigers or lions or, the list goes on. That made Bob Payne, by the way. I'll just throw that out there because often the question comes, how to think about humans. What's that?
Oh, no, I was just saying, go for it.
Oh, okay, I was going to go for it. Yeah. So I have two poignant stories to tell about Bob Payne. I'll try to get through the first, which is really tough. There's a longer theatrical version of this movie that was released and went through festivals before you see the TV version. And and you see a little bit of Bob in this movie. Just as we were getting ready to start filming, but after I had made a short film with Bob, Bob was diagnosed with leukemia, and we kind of thought time was on our side a bit. It turns out things went very quickly, but Bob summoned the filmmakers, in fact, to his hospital room in Seattle, and wanted to go on the record. So we filmed an interview with Bob from a bed he wound up never leaving. In between all sorts of colleagues, Bob had an incredible training record. He was an incredible mentor, and all sorts of great people had worked with Bob, and they were coming to visit to essentially, say farewell. And so our director, I don't know how he handled this duty. That's beyond my emotional resilience, was interviewing Bob, and in between those takes were rather emotional visits with Bob, with people Bob held dear, and vice versa. But I think what a statement that he was about 83 years old, and in the last 10 days of his life, and he wanted to go on the record to talk about these things and what he thought was important. The second story about Bob, I just knocked out of him. Oh yeah, and then it turns out on the day he passed away, his last paper was published in which he described humans as hyper keystones. So I thought there were two poignant parts to Bob's story in this film, and so he just thought, we're hyper keystones because basically we sit atop all these food chains, right? And the apex predators and the keystones are all vulnerable to our activities, and we've made a big change in these systems generally from our activity. So as I said, the question of how to think about humans ecologically often comes up in these discussions, and I lean on Bob there because I think the description of hyper keystone sitting among all is apt.
So Sean, I have a question.
Good to see ya.
Hi.
Hi.
I love your book. but in your book, you had molecular feedback, negative feedback, and you had homeostasis in physiology. Are you going to have another movie?
About all that stuff? No, I think we decided we'd peel that out in sort of some other ways, probably more for the classroom. Yeah, I think when we started, I mean, filmmakers who wanted to turn the book into the movie, there was some thinking about how are you going to get these sort of ideas about regulation out there, and I think it just became unwieldy, and so it wound up being about the ecology, and particularly about well, you see the beginnings of this in the end of the movie of if you know this, how can you manage the world differently? So I think it was just a decision to go there. I'd love, Dick, to tell the story of Charles Elton, who's in there, and Walter Cannon, and some of this regulatory logic, but this is kind of the difference between a book and a movie. Book, you can sprawl, you can dive deep. In a movie, the pacing's got to be there to make that work, and you have to try to keep a pretty broad audience, sort of where we use kind of all on the train, and that was pretty. I think we rightfully made the decision it was going to be pretty hard to mix molecular biology and ecology in a single film. But your question is, will there be other films that deal with that part of things? Not immediately on the horizon. I have to tell you, we got a lot of stuff going on, but not that part of this book. So
okay.
Thanks. I've got to read the book, because that sounds really interesting to me.
I dared in a few chapters actually talk about regulation at the molecular. The book kind of the theme of the book is like everything is regulated. The first half is sort of at the cellular and molecular level, and the second half is at the ecological level. And the ecological level made it to the movies, and the first part didn't.
Made it to the movie.
That's how it goes. But that's a good, fair representation. I mean, books have more content than can make it into a 90-minute movie usually, or this book did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll go along with Richard's sort of question, or at the same idea that should make it into a movie itself, hopefully eventually. So we have another question from the chat that I think is really, really interesting. Is there a role for microbes in large animal ecosystems? And sort of going along with those lines, I'll add to that, is there a role with microbes to actually act, or whether it be bacteria or viruses, to actually act as sort of these keystone species?
Yeah, when in sort of the cascade of the Serengeti, you have this situation where, of course, you have the wildebeest that are sort of grooming the Serengeti for so many other things. So that simple act of munching the grass and that circuit they make around the Serengeti, that shapes the habitat, that influences not just tree growth through the fire regime, and therefore food source for giraffes, but cover for predators, nesting sites for birds. It also affects the grasses and flowers that grow on the plains. But you can see that a virus like rinderpest, sort of turned the activity of the wildebeest up or down. And there have been some cases, and I'm now scratching my head to think, you can think about some parasites that if they're all this is about regulation. So are they regulating the abundance of something else in the system that then sort of has a strong knock-on effect? So when I think about, so here's a case of a virus that essentially was behaving, in an outsized manner, but we understood it was doing that by affecting mortality of a keystone. I'm going to have a little trouble thinking, because again, the keystones being the definition of something with a really outsized impact on the whole system relative to its abundance. And I can't, no other example pops into mind. I wouldn't eliminate it when I think about viruses and parasites, or perhaps a pathogenic bacteria, but I don't think about them, for example, in freshwater marine systems, I think the keystones are macrofauna.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's actually a comment in the chat that potentially, we just talked about these certain examples, but potentially viruses and bacteria could be the ultimate keystones. Who knows? It's an interesting idea, but I agree. It's sort of like what you
Well,
said.
the key is that, are they
macrofauna.
having a disproportionate effect on the diversity of the whole community? And no examples pop into mind. Again, I'm not gonna eliminate it, but I think that in these food chains, usually you have the single-celled organisms are at the bottom of the food chain, and they should be controlled by grazers that are just up above from them, and then in turn those grazers are controlled. And so, and if these are photosynthetic organisms at the bottom, then they're really important as being the primary producers in the system, but they wouldn't necessarily be the keystones.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much. We invite, so if there's more questions, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
It almost sounded like an ecological explanation, which again, may I reiterate this disclaimer that I'm a molecular biologist who spent all my life.
I'd like to get to Don Walfer's question about the wolves, if you want to ask.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Of course, yeah. So we have another question, and I think you sort of touched on this a little bit, Sean. Are the wolves that have been introduced to northern Wisconsin considered a keystone species?
I think it's probably suspected, and many of you will know the history better than I can recall from Wisconsin. But my understanding would be that our deer, speaking of Wisconsin in the first person, our deer herd is probably 100 times what it was at the beginning of the 20th century, and I think we can ascribe a lot of that to extermination of wolves, and in turn. At least, most places I'm familiar with, and I can't say I've read studies on, northern forests of Wisconsin, but, all over the eastern seaboard, forests have been hammered by deer in ways, where they're just obliterated plant diversity. And so I think you've got the situation where the loss of predators has led to a huge overabundance of grazers like deer. And that's hammered community diversity at the plant level. It's also the case that there is no ecology of fear in these forests without these predators, and so these things are grazing, in patterns that they wouldn't be grazing even if it weren't for wolves consuming them. At least the fear of predation would be modifying deer behavior. So I think the suspicion is yes. I don't know if anyone asserts this in particular, but wolves in general across Northern Europe, in the American West, yeah, keystones. Again, defining it as this disproportionate effect on community diversity. In this case, you can see overabundance of deer. I don't know whether that's led to overcompetition against any other herbivores, but certainly plant diversity has been the major victim of that. Tom, you might be muted. There you are.
Yeah, it's particularly germane because the DNR I think this morning announced they're going to have a hunt of about 200 out of the 1,200 wolves known to be in Wisconsin due to a lawsuit. So that's a big chunk of the population.
Yeah, and in the West, there's pressure to hunt wolves in the West too, and this winds up in federal courts a lot. It's really hard to figure out. I don't know the data from Wisconsin on, for example, livestock losses or whatever, but before the wolves were released in the Yellowstone, greater Yellowstone area, it was 20 years of public comment and study and predictions made by biologists as to what the livestock losses would be, and those predictions were in the right ballpark. If anything, they were a little high. And the livestock losses in the greater Yellowstone system, to wolves have been really minor. Now, if you happen to be the one, ranch that loses 10 sheep, well, that's small consolation. But, net, I mean, the wolves, the restoration of the wolves has had a huge impact on the Yellowstone system. including the vegetation. You probably know the story of what's happened on, from cottonwoods to willow and all that. But in addition, and I think this is the thing going into the, into the future, economically, wolves are probably worth more alive than dead, certainly in Yellowstone, because visitors are clamoring to get a glimpse of a wolf, even if it's, 1,000 yards away and all you can see is a tail. It's kind of like the whale watching business. I mean, whales are worth a hell of a lot more alive now than they ever were dead. So, I understand, I'm sympathetic to economic losses if people are actually suffering them, but I think we can probably have, and there was what do you call it when a compensation fund if people take some losses. So I think a compensation fund or something like that is a way to manage this, and then just hunting the wolves out. It just seems like it's regression. We know better, but obviously political forces don't always move in the direction of science.
We invite more questions. We've got a couple more minutes. If there are any questions.
I have a quick question, if you guys can hear me.
Go for it.
Thanks for a great movie. I wanted to ask quick if you knew if there were studies kind of like looking at what kinds of characteristics of a species helped predict how it would regulate the diversity of the ecology it was in, or how it would regulate the biomass of the ecology it was in.
It's a great question. Nothing's popping into my mind, but my God, there are ecologically more informed people on this Zoom call. I think the characteristics and things are so situational because, wildebeest are a keystone on the Serengeti, but not elsewhere in Africa. They're not a keystone in South Africa. They're not a keystone in Kruger. They're not a keystone in Mozambique, some places that I know. And that just, that happens to do with just the configuration of the local system. So the other thing is when we start putting labels on things, we're like, the same question about wolves in Wisconsin. I think the answer to that was, yeah, probably, definitely, and certainly other places where it's demonstrated, but something doesn't necessarily play the same role. The same species or sort of an equivalent species doesn't play the same role every place, across the world. So when you think, what characteristics, that probably makes it harder to identify characteristics of what might be a keystone, because it's probably more about the evolution of the ecosystem and the relationships between those species in that ecosystem than necessarily some outstanding characteristics of that individual species. Seeing it a lot with predators, you understand these systems where there might be one top predator. Well, that one top predator turns out if it's regulating the abundance of, grazers, of herbivores, then you have kind of the setup for this situation. Yeah, but there are other predators, by the way, in those intertidals, but the starfish dominate.
Thanks.
They're predatory snails. They just don't amount to much. Sorry, Bob Payne. You spent a lot of time on those snails.
Are there other questions? All right, I think as the host of this one, I'll take advantage of being the host and ask the final question, Sean. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your journey going from an evolutionary biologist, which you still are, to a science communicator, working on films and writing books and stuff like that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, maybe, the first part was I kind of stayed in my lane. So as an evolutionary biologist, I wrote about evolution. I wrote some books about the evolution of animal form. I wrote some books sort of in general about sort of emerging view of sort of molecular genetics of evolution, and even some stories about some great explorers and pioneers, in the business. I think I got out of my lane when I started writing books about people in the French Resistance and ecologists and things like this. But maybe I'll just that was all a very gradual process of going from writing, formal scientific articles, to writing reviews, to getting interviewed a fair amount by the press or for other documentaries, giving public talks. It was a very gradual thing into writing books and participating in films. In this particular film that you just saw, and doing something about ecology, I think, and for the last decade or so, I've just been really, the reason I became a biologist is I just, love nature, and I especially love animals. And I've been a log flipper since I was a little kid. And it kept gnawing at me that, here we were having a great time doing indoor biology and discovering sort of what we could about the workings of animals, while knowing that outside in the larger world, for example, in the last 40 years, half of all wildlife has disappeared, by the numbers. And it just became and sort of, incongruent for me to hold those two thoughts of just to enjoy the indoor work and ignore what was going on. But I felt I needed to go talk to people and talk to ecologists and talk to conservationists and see what was going on. So this journey for this book started in the Serengeti, my first trip there, something I had seen on TV for 35 years or whatever and read about. But I can tell you, if you haven't been there, nothing you've ever seen, including this movie, will spoil the joy of being there. It's an overwhelmingly stunning and rich place. And then the book ended in a place called Gorongosa, which you also saw in the movie, where I visited there in 2015 and saw a place that had been left for dead, decimated by civil war. Almost all the large, 95% plus of the large animals poached out. And, this philanthropist named Greg Carr thought he would try to make it his life's work to bring a place like Gorongosa back. And fortunately, they were far enough into that experiment that the results are very encouraging. And you saw in this film the reintroduction of wild dogs. And actually, we made a feature film now further on from the moment of the reintroduction of the wild dogs for Nova that played fall of 2019. Fall of 2020. COVID has screwed up my recollection of so many things. It's called Nature's Fear Factor, and it's reintroduction. It's also the role of predators, particularly in modifying the behavior of prey, and sort of weighing what's the bigger impact of predators, is it on consumption or on behavior. Anyway, so I think this part of ecology and conservation is just a manifestation of my concern that the things that I think all of biologists and most of the public love are having a really hard time, but they need to know what can be done. So I'm not a gloom and doomer, and this movie hopefully was not too gloomy. I want to know what can be done. So what can be done, and you can see, is sometimes you protect or bring back the right species, the recovery can be pretty dramatic. And so we're spending a fair amount of time encouraging the telling of those stories with some of our journalism partners. We have a whole bunch of films in the works that are looking at different stories, from everything of the rewilding of some farms, spectacular story coming out of England, to the importance of systems like mangroves and seagrass and salt marshes, on the coasts, and sort of new insights to the working of forests and what happened. Can you rewild rivers when you take down dams? All these things are in the pipeline, and they're all kind of addressing that question of what can be done. So that was a broader, sweep there. I kind of hijacked your question, I mean, to say not so much about my personal career of storytelling, but what's the point? Why did I had everything was great at Wisconsin. Lab was running at full throttle. I had incredible talent in my lab. We're having a great time, but this opportunity came to come to Hughes and work both on what happens in the classroom through media and the public communication of science. In some film like Serengeti it's gone to more than 100 countries. I think it's 120 some odd festivals across the world. It's gotten a huge, response, again, all across the world. And I think I hope it's a hopeful film that people understand there are things that can be done. So I just tried to find a little bigger megaphone for some of my, well, not mine really. I guess it's probably a bigger megaphone for science. These ecologists that are profiled here, 4 of them are National Academy members, but they felt that really their work was not well known. And I'm happy to say that of all the film critics, they're very happy with the film. And so, somebody entrusts you with their story of their life's work, you don't want to blow that one. So so the opportunity to collaborate with really creative people like the filmmakers in this film, with other scientists and telling their stories, and to disseminate these stories globally, that's a very incremental progression, but that's part of why I moved to DC.
Cool. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for giving a platform for these stories. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and, or unless there's other questions, we'll go ahead and end this. Thank you so much, Sean, for doing this and for joining us for this Q&A. Before we end things, I'd like to invite you all to our last event for Darwin Day 2021, which is a panel on Wednesday, which also is part of our regularly scheduled Wednesday night at the lab on the coevolution of mammals and microbes. We'll have panelists Dr. Gemma Jegan from the University of Otago, Dr. Aspen Reese from the University of California, San Diego, Dr. Paul Turner from Yale University, and this panel and lecture, will be moderated by Dr. Tony Goldberg and Dr. Caitlin Pepperell from here at UW-Madison. And with that, again, thank you so much, Sean, for joining us. And we hope to see you all